All right, gentlemen, what I want to do for just a minute or two right now is I want us to kind of review where we have come from and some of the things that we have talked about thus far in order to put all of this in proper perspective. Number one, the first thing we looked at was how do we prove the existence of God? We followed that up with, okay, if God's alive, how do we know He speaks to us today in the year 2009 or 2010? We then follow that up with, okay, if the Bible is inspired, what does that mean in contrast to Jesus Christ? Did He come to this earth? Was He a liar, lunatic, or Lord? So with those three fundamental planks in place, we then turned our eyes on things like evil, pain, and suffering. One of the challenges against God. We looked at things like some of the alleged hoaxes that are out there. So what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, or last couple of classes, is primarily looking at the hoaxes and some of the problems with evolution. Today I want us to kind of switch gears a little bit, and I want us to focus more on some of the creation model, specifically on the account of the flood. It's probably maybe one of your favorite accounts in the Bible. To me, it is one of the most telling. It's one of the most revealing as far as giving us the characteristics of a God who will not put up with sin. Before we begin that, before we really take a close look at that, I want to get some input from you as to what do you think the antediluvian world was like, and ultimately what are we saying about God through this account? That was a question. Somebody tried to, let's say I'm a 10-year-old and I come up to you and I say, hey, Mommy, Daddy, Grandmom, Granddad, what was it like before the flood? What are you going to tell them?
There was no rain or no precipitation, we believe. On the earth. We would also say that everyone was vegetarian and people or animals didn't eat meat until God established His covenant with Noah after he got off the ark.
I'll 100% agree with you on the vegetation thing. We're going to talk a little bit about the rain thing. What else?
The landscape was totally different. It's probably a lot more flat than it is now.
Okay.
Probably more tropical in nature.
All right. What would all of this lead to? You guys are missing probably the key component.
Before the flood. Well, even pre-Adam and Eve. Well, not pre-Adam and Eve, but before they ate of the tree. I mean, that was God's original design. That was His plan for us to live with Him and with one another in peace and harmony. And
okay.
Sin broke that.
Okay.
It separated us from Him, and then, man became so wicked. God had just had enough. And it was time to destroy man.
Brad, are you talking about... Oh, sorry.
No.
You're talking about...
Go ahead, Dean.
God walking with man in the garden?
Well, that was obviously probably the most awesome thing that's happened to mankind. But think with me for just a moment. There's a major difference that you guys haven't hit on yet, and I'm trying to get my computer to work here. There we go. Take a look at this verse. Genesis chapter 5, verse 5. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. What's the big deal?
That's pretty old.
Guys, had you gone to an old person's home, 100 would be young. I heard somebody say Wayne Berger. That is so wrong. 100 years old, you would still be basically in your adolescence. I mean, people like Jerry would be considered to be babes, literally. All right, how do we explain this, guys? Because I come at it from a perspective of, I don't want you just to simply tell me that's what the Bible says. Because I deal in a world of skeptics, I deal in a world of people who are constantly hurling accusations against the Bible. They don't believe the Bible to begin with. So you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. I want to hear from y'all's lips how this could be possible. And the crickets were chirping. Let me just say, if I'm a skeptic, so far y'all have gotten about a D in converting me.
Well, couldn't you prove that there was a flood?
Mm-hmm.
Massive worldwide flood?
Mm-hmm.
Based off of ancient literature?
But you're going to have to back up before the flood. How were people able to live to that age? Or maybe we're supposed to look at that and think, you know, they didn't really measure time the same way, or maybe we divided by 10, or maybe they used a different calendar system. But if I'm a skeptic or your 10-year-old granddaughter, I want to know, how did Adam live to be 930 years old?
The firmament, there was like a protective canopy.
Okay.
When God separated the waters from above the firmament, from the waters under the firmament.
Okay, so Jerry's starting to lay some groundwork here. Finally, somebody breaking through and helping me. So you got a protected firmament. So the environment was probably different, was it not?
Absolutely.
What about mankind in particular? How long, guys, don't ever miss the fact that how long were Adam and Eve supposed to live?
Forever.
Okay, so God had fashioned them to be able to live forever. So does it make sense that they would be able to live to vast old ages? Absolutely. You add to that what we're going to be talking about in a minute, and the fact that there were not the disorders, the diseases that we have today. You add to that the fact that they had increased oxygen and a much, as God put it, a very good environment to live in. And suddenly you've got a recipe for an existence that would allow them to easily live into these vast old ages.
Hey,
Take a look at this quote from Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace. Somebody tell me who Alfred Russel Wallace was. Oh, I know this is going to be on your final. This was the gentleman who was down in Borneo who sent his manuscript to Charles Darwin. Yeah, that explained natural selection. Yeah, that Charles Darwin beat to the punch, cheating him out. Here's what he said. He said, there is but one climate known to the ancient fossil world as revealed by the plants and the animals entombed in the rocks. And the climate was a mantle of spring-like loveliness which seems to have prevailed over the whole globe. He said, just how the world could have been this warm all over may be a matter of conjecture. But that it was so warmed effectively and continuously is a matter of fact. So all the way back in the 1800s, we already recognized through the fossil layers that this world used to be different. It used to be this mantle of spring-like loveliness. In fact, E.H. Colbert, in his book, Evolutionary Growth Rates in the Dinosaurs, he said in those days the Earth had a tropical or subtropical climate over much of its land surface, and in the widespread tropical lands there was an abundance of lush vegetation. So you've got this mantle of spring-like loveliness, you've got an abundance of lush vegetation, And that's exactly what we see in the fossil record. If my 10-year-old or a skeptic came up to me and said, Brad, I want you to prove that to me, the first thing we do is we open up the diaries of Admirals Byrd and Perry. Somebody tell me what these two men discovered.
I'm going to guess the poles, or one of the poles or something.
Yeah. These are the guys that traveled to the poles. So we read about them not only being all alone, being in miserable conditions, being out there in the ice, but we also read about them looking down into the ice and seeing things like palm trees and fruit trees buried literally feet below in the ice. Or we could talk to our kids about coal. We know today one of the requirements to make coal is a tremendous amount of green living vegetation. Because basically what coal is, it is stuff that was once alive that has been put under heat and pressure. And basically the easiest way for you to think about it is it's been fossilized into what we would call charcoal. And yet, where is one of the largest coal reserves on our planet? Bearing in mind that you got to have lots of vegetation in order to make coal, and yet we know Antarctica has one of the largest coal reserves. Telling us that has not always been a frozen, barren wasteland. In fact, just down the street from you guys, the University of Colorado reported in August of 2004 they had identified pine needles under 10,400 feet of ice in Greenland. So can I prove, scientifically speaking, without ever opening my Bible, that this earth used to be different? And the answer is absolutely. This is literally just a small tip of the iceberg, just kind of whet your appetite kind of deal. But the fact of the matter is, usually both evolutionists and creationists will admit something has changed. R.L. Wysong, in talking about it, he put it this way. He said, under the ice caps were found palm leaves, fruit trees, tropical marine crustaceans. Vast forests of luxuriant subtropical plant life are also buried under the polar caps. And on the other extreme, the great deserts of the world show evidence of once being humid and subtropically rich areas. Thus, there is evidence for a uniform tropical-like environment. Now, we have basically now set the stage to begin talking about the flood. But we still got to add one or two components to that.
Hey, Brad.
So you picture in your mind, you've got this mantle of spring-like loveliness. You've got most of the environment is this tropical-like environment. And then we ask this question. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Did God say his creation was good?
Yes, very good.
He said it was very good. So let's take just a minute. You guys tell me what all was missing from that. What all is different today than back then?
Thorns and thistles.
Okay?
Diet.
Diet. I'm talking more specifically about what mankind has done to the earth. What is around us today?
Definitely pollution.
Industry.
Got a lot of pollution. Okay? What else?
Industry.
Got a lot of industry. Think about this. One of the things that most people miss when they read the first 6 chapters of the Bible. In fact, if you've got a Bible, go ahead. Take a look in Genesis chapter 3. Look at Genesis chapter 3. Somebody read verse 17.
And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, I have eaten from the and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and toil you will eat of it all the days of your life.
Okay. As you read through the opening chapters, what you're going to find is every time man sinned, not only did he punish man, he punished what else?
The earth.
The ground.
Yeah.
That was one of the big deals when, if you look in Genesis chapter 5, let's see, look at verse 29 of Genesis 5. Look, well, I'm going to back up. Lamech lived 182 years. He had a son. He called his name Noah, saying, This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because the ground which the Lord has cursed. Every time man was sinning, God was punishing man and the ground. And in fact, that is played out to where in Genesis chapter 9, when he is making his covenant, he says, No longer will I curse the ground.
So Brad, are you saying that?
Yes.
Are you saying that disease and contamination came about to the earth because we had the toil, we had to produce our own food. That was cursed, and so disease and contamination to the animals and to the plants. I don't know.
Possibly, but I think more realistically what it's talking about here is you've got an environment that used to basically grow things without any input from man.
Right. Oh.
And suddenly it's sand or it's hard clay, and you've got to break your back just to get enough food to eat. And the more we messed up, the more areas that were like that. So God has taken this perfect greenhouse, and little by little, he is just absolutely wearing it out to the point where finally Lamech says, I've got a son, he's going to be the one that delivers us from all the cursing of this ground. Now, do I think this is also probably when some diseases and things were brought in? Absolutely, and that's what we're going to talk about. If you think about it for just a moment, if I asked you guys the question, today, why is it that human beings die at such a relatively young age? You start rattling off things like, well, we've got we've got Alzheimer's, we've got Parkinson's, we've got all these different diseases. We've got congestive heart failure. We've got, various and sundry things. But if you think about it for just a moment, we've got over 1,600 harmful genetic mutations in our gene pool. None of which is any good for us. And I seriously doubt in that room right now, as you guys are sitting there, I bet if I were to start rattling off a few of them, every single one of you have got at least one in your family. Because we have things like cancer, we got things like diabetes, we got things like high blood pressure, we've got things like, you name it. And the list goes on and on and on. And none of which, again, is any good for mankind. Now, let's stop right here for just a moment. How many of these harmful genetic mutations were around when God first placed Adam and Eve in the garden?
None.
Guys, there could not have been any. And the reason why I say that is everything was pronounced by God as very good. God's not going to pronounce something very good if we've got Down syndrome in the gene pool, if we've got all of these various disorders. So we've got a very good creation. Man is able to live for a long period of time. And yet today, now we march ourselves 6,000 years in the present. Why do you guys think we have these things today?
It's probably a big deal.
Sin is definitely a part of it. Scientifically speaking, what is DNA supposed to do? It really has only one job. What is that job?
Is it to replicate and reproduce itself?
It is to copy itself. It is supposed to be a Xerox machine. So in every cell of your body, you've got this little Xerox machine that holds the genetic code for you. Now you think about how many times you have to make Xerox copies. Have you guys ever made Xerox copies that don't come out crystal clear? Absolutely. Guys, the way to think about this is if you were to put, say, your final exam, you get a copy of it and you put it on a Xerox machine. And you make a copy. And then you take the copy that you made and you put it on the platen and you make another copy. And you keep doing that about 30 or 40 times, every time taking the new copy. What's going to happen by that 30th time?
Junk.
Is it going to be clear?
No.
Or is it going to be very fuzzy looking?
Fuzzy.
Absolutely. Same thing is going on with your genes. Same thing is going on with your DNA. We are now 6,000 years post Adam and Eve. Human DNA has been replicating now for 6,000 years. We all agree that we are from the lineage of Eve, Genesis 3:20. So anytime one of these genetic mutations get introduced into a family line, a branch, it's in there. And unless it drops out because of a duplication or replication or some kind of mutation, then it's going to be in there and pop up every once in a while. Because again, all that DNA is supposed to do is be a Xerox machine. It's just to simply replicate itself. Questions or comments so far?
Brad?
Yes, sir. By the way, guys, I can't see you right now, so if y'all will just holler at me, that'll be great. Go ahead.
What scientific evidence do we have for a canopy theory?
For a canopy theory?
Yep.
Scientific evidence. Let me get back to you on that one. Right off the top of my head, I would say we probably don't have a whole lot because it's not there anymore.
True.
We do have Bible verses, and I know the Bible is inspired, and so it's pretty easy for me to think about that. But I got a couple of books that I will grab and take a quick peek at.
Because, I'm just coming at it, you're talking about how you're playing the part of the skeptic. If you say there's a canopy that protected the earth, the skeptic's going to say, okay, well, what's the evidence? And if you say, oh, well, the Bible says there was, then that's not...
Well, I guess I would come at it from two ways right off the top of my head. Number one, how do you make this earth a beautiful greenhouse that the fossil record shows was a greenhouse? How do you get tropical plants in Antarctica? How do you make the Sahara Desert growing lush vegetation? Something had to be different. And then number two, where do you get all the water for the flood? Those would be the two things I would throw right off the top of my head, but I will throw something else at you maybe as early as when we come back from the break.
Okay.
All right. Here, guys, is the problem that we have with society. All of you have probably seen the Guinness Book of Records. And our kids, they buy one, they look at it, they're enthralled with all the different records that are set in there. One of the ones that everybody likes to look up is who's the oldest person who's ever lived. Guinness Book of Records tell us that Madame Janine Louise Calment of France lived to be 122 years, 164 days old. And they accept that as the truth, not realizing that we have another book that gives us a much more impressive record. All the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Do you see where our kids can get sucked into thinking from a secular worldview? rather than a biblical worldview. And guys, if we don't paint for them the truth about what it was like in the pre-flood world, and we start giving them this evidence, and we say, hey, look, things were different back then basically they're going to put a lot of their allegiance in something like, something as trivial as the Guinness Book of Records. All right. How do we prove that from the Bible? If you have a Bible, somebody open it up to, let's see. Let's go to about Genesis chapter 17. Actually, I'm sorry, Genesis 12. Let's go to Genesis 12. Read to me verse 11.
It came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, "See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman."
Therefore it shall come to pass, the Egyptians shall say that they'll say, this is his wife, they'll kill me, but save thee alive. So say thee, I pray, that thou art my sister. Now, before we talk about all of this, was Abraham lying?
No, not
Really?
not totally. It's a half truth.
Why?
Because
She was half sister. Yeah.
Okay. We know realistically they were a half-brother, half-sister. But the point is, Abraham looks at his wife and realizes, you know what? The Pharaoh's going to want her. He's going to take her into his house. So they make up, and guys, remember, this is back, if you back up to this particular picture, remember Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. He goes he's exposed into the land of Canaan. And then there's a famine in the land. So he's got to push on down to Egypt. Now, just before he gets into Egypt, he's turning to his wife. He says, look, let's just, you tell him I'm your sister. Somebody summarize me what happens.
Pharaoh takes her into his house, and his house is, I guess, cursed by God.
Okay?
And basically God tells him not to touch her. And then Abraham fesses up, and Pharaoh gives him a whole lot of money and stuff. Sheep and cattle.
All right, Paul, tell me about how old Sarah was when Abraham made that statement. Somebody help him.
She had to be 75?
Yeah, she was pushing 70, guys.
Yeah, she was right there.
Now let's drop back and think about that for just a minute. This lady is pushing 70 years old, and Abraham is worried about looking at her beauty. Now, I don't mean any disrespect to any ladies ever. I mean, since this is being recorded, I will just go on record saying I know my wife's going to be beautiful at 75. But, guys, olive Olay is good. It ain't that good.
Goodness.
So, here is a crystal clear example that things were different back then. And these are the kinds of examples that we need to make sure that we get across to our kids to show them, yes, we know things were different. That here you got a lady, she's 70 years old, and yet she is still, her beauty radiates so much that Abraham is worried that she's going to be taken in by the Pharaoh.
Brad?
Yes, sir.
Because the DNA wasn't 6,000 years down the line continually copying itself, would that have effect on how someone looked at 75? So you could have someone that looked 30 that we would call, but was actually like 75. Would that be possible?
Possibly. But Dean, tell me this: what actually causes us to? What's one of the main things that causes your skin to age and look aged? Sun. UV rays from the sun. Now, again, you asked for scientific evidence for the canopy. If you've got this canopy, this other layer out there, then you got another filter besides the ozone that is filtering the sun's harmful UV rays. So it would actually help with folks not aging, or at least not appearing to age as quickly. All kinds of really cool stuff that, you know, when you really stop and think about it, intricately, they kind of tie in together into this whole package.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go ahead and get rid of one question before we tackle the topic. Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived. James, where'd Cain's wife come from?
I don't know. I mean, if she's living, she had to have come from Eve, right?
All right, let's look at three options.
Well, Eve's
Option number one. Option number one. I'm gonna unplug my PowerPoint. Could God have, actually, I tell you what, guys, I keep unplugging and plugging in. I'm going to actually try to take it off this way. Let me see if that works. Option number one. Could God have, if he'd wanted, taken groups of people, placed them all over the planet? Cain wandered into one of those groups of people, found a wife, married her, and lived happily ever after. That's option number one. Option number two. Somebody read me Genesis chapter 5, verse 4.
In the days of Adam, after he had begotten Seth, were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters.
Okay, the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve had other children after Seth. So is it possible that Cain waited until his younger brothers and sisters grew of age, that they got married, and then, lo and behold, he decides, you know what, I'm going to marry my niece? That's option number two. Or option number three, could he have simply just married his sister? That's our three options. Hey, there we go. I think I figured this thing out. After 2 quarters of working on this thing, I think I'm actually figuring it out. What's the problem with option number one?
They wouldn't have come from Eve.
Right, it violates Scripture. Genesis chapter 3, verse 20 says, Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Option number one, throw it out the window. It is no good. What about option number two? Is it any good?
I would say yeah.
The possibility, absolutely. In fact, it will probably forever remain a possibility. However, I think given the amount of time that Cain would have had to wait for his younger brothers and sisters to grow up, to marry, to have children, for that child to get grown up, I think the best option is option number three. I think Cain married his sister. So here's a question for us to think about. Obviously, we know things changed. The question is, all right, what caused that change? And what changed it to the way we see it today? Guys, I think the thing that provided the majority of the change is the flood. Tell me how members of the church view the flood.
Poetic?
As a what?
Some people view it as a poetic writing.
Okay? What else?
People I know treat it as a fact.
Anybody ever heard somebody say that it's a good story?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I know Jerry did not just correct my scripture references.
Yeah, I just try to help you out.
Well, you see grown animals going into the ark 2 by 2.
Okay?
That's what.
Think about how we portray it in Bible classes, guys. How many times we see a cartoon caricature of the flood, the ark. You got animals hanging over the top of it looking out. I mean, it's, giraffes' heads sticking up through the top of the roof. Very childish, very ridiculous. And because of that, oftentimes we don't view it as a real event. I'm telling you, if you leave a congregation and you have not preached on the seriousness of sin and taught them the evidences for the flood and what that means and what the result is, you've done them a disservice. Do we have evidence for the flood?
Yes.
Absolutely. If I were to ask you, what do we find on the tops of just about every major mountaintop? The answer is aquatic fossils. In fact, when I ask atheists or evolutionists, I'll send them pictures like this one from some of the high points all over the world. People have sent me images, and I simply ask them the question, hey, how did this happen? And their answer is always the same. They say, well, it's a local flood. And guys, I might be able to accept that if I just sent them one picture on one continent. But when you send like 5 different pictures from 5 different continents, and they're still saying local flood, that's an awfully big local flood. Let's talk about the man for just a minute. Go by numbers, Noah was a what? Guys, if you go strictly by numbers, he was a failure.
Oh, yeah.
By that I mean he preached for roughly 100 years and didn't convert anybody outside of his immediate family. Can you imagine a congregation allowing you to stay for a long, long time with those kind of matriculation rates? They would be like, thank you very much, pack your bags. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others. He brought a flood upon the world. The point being, guys, at least he saved his family.
Amen.
I cannot stress to you guys enough the importance of your family, focusing on your family, getting your family to heaven, having your family as a mission. If you look at Noah in that perspective, he was a massive success because he got his whole family on that boat. What kind of evidence do we have that the flood was real? If I were, again, playing the role of the skeptic, obviously we do have the Bible. It is inspired by God. It talks about a worldwide flood. But as I mentioned earlier, not everybody is going to accept that. At which point we need to then remind them that other civilizations have major records of these massive floods, these worldwide floods. What's the first one that comes to your mind? You guys y'all are either asleep this morning. How about the Epic of Gilgamesh? Have any of you heard of that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Just making sure. How about, let's see, the epic of Atrahasis-Old Babylonian. The Hittites had a record. The Sumerians had a record. The Greeks had a record. The Mayans had a record. In fact, one of the unique things, if you really do study this, you're going to find that virtually all the Indo-European cultures have a memory or a record of Japheth, one of the sons of Noah. In fact, they actually tie themselves back to this man. So as you look on the screen, you'll notice a lot of these various cultures would tie themselves back to Japheth or Japheth. Ironically, and this is one of those things, again, Dean, when I'm dealing with skeptics who won't prove, the Myazo people of China, when the first missionaries arrived there, they already knew not only creation account, but also the flood. They claimed not to be of Chinese descent, but from Japheth. So, we've got the Bible speaking of it. We've got early records of it in cultures all over the place. We've got these ancient cultures who knew about the flood, who claimed to be from Japheth. Ian Wilson said, surely a real-life flood must lie behind these stories. The collective memory scattered over the wide geographical distances is too prevalent, too deep-seated for this not to have been the case. Clearly, there are grounds to suspect that what have often been tossed aside as flood myths had considerable foundation in fact. So then we stop and we say, okay, what are the skeptics' charges? You know, what is it that they wrestle with and that they struggle with? Number one, that they would say probably Noah wasn't smart enough. That he would not have been smart enough to build a vessel that big. Because, guys, think about it for just a moment. Not only was this a massive boat, this was the largest boat ever constructed to its day, and you got a guy here who was a preacher of righteousness for 100 years, who basically, prior to this, had no shipbuilding skills. What does the Bible say about Noah?
Righteous.
Okay? Look at Genesis chapter 6. Now somebody read to me verse 9.
These are the records of the generations of Noah. And Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time, and Noah walked with God.
All right. So we've got a righteous or just man, perfect in his generations, and the text says he walked with God. How many other people in the Bible do we read that about?
Maybe just one, Enoch.
Enoch, and I would throw in one more. Adam. Guys, that's a pretty elite list to be on right there. But you've got evolutionists who look at it and say, wait a second. He wasn't smart enough. He basically would not have had the shipbuilding skills to build a boat that big. How do you answer that? Given everything that we've discussed so far in our class, how would you answer that?
Well, we have evidence, well, this is going back to the Bible, but we have evidence that man was created intelligent and that we didn't have to acquire it over millions of years.
Okay.
Well,
If you were trying to convince me, what would you turn to?
Biblically, you mean?
Yep.
When Adam named the animals.
All right. So let's go back to Genesis 2. Genesis 2, starting in verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I'll make him a helper comparable to him. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every bird of the air, brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. Whatever Adam called each of the living creatures, that was his name. So Adam gave name to all the cattle, to the birds of the air, to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not a helper comparable to him." So, literally before Eve is created, he's already naming the animals. Now, the point being, guys, that shows incredible intelligence. I don't care how you look at it. The ability to communicate with God and to name something, to memorize that, shows incredible intelligence. You know, the implication is not that he's just out there going, cow, elephant. He is remembering the names to be able to pass it on to his offspring. Next time somebody asks you or tells you that Noah wouldn't have had enough intelligence to build the boat, simply ask them this. You know, things like the ancient pyramids or the Sphinx or Stonehenge, how did those things get there? Because, guys, the reality of it is they do exist. We can touch them today, but we don't have a clue of how they got there. Used to work with a guy by the name of Dwayne. Dwayne Bryant has done a couple of digs over in Egypt, and he shared with me the fact that they know specifically where some of those rocks were cut for the pyramids because of the vein of marble that it was cut from. So you've got stones that they now know weighed roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 tons that were cut over 200 miles away. How do you take a stone 60 tons, 200 miles, when you don't even have, I mean, guys, how would you do that today? You'd have to shut down the interstate, quite literally. Because that oversized load sign, man, you're talking about an oversized load. And yet we know they did it. So, skeptics' argument number one, throw it out the window. That's garbage. We don't even know how they did these things. I would point out to you, by the way, do not underestimate the intelligence of early civilizations. Folks, they were a whole lot smarter than we give them credit for. You got civilizations that had running water. You got the hanging gardens, where they had basically what we would consider today an irrigation system. It's funny, those of you who have read about the hanging gardens and have been to Epcot Center in Florida. Epcot Center, they've got plants that are growing in this tube that are being constantly bathed in water, where you can see the root system on the inside, the plant growing on the outside, and there's no dirt. And they're basically pumping this up as, the gardening of the future. I'm like, you're stupid. You missed it. That's what they were doing back then. That's the hanging gardens. We've talked, I think, already about the fact that over in Latin America, there were towns that were set up to where you could physically be standing anywhere in that particular civilization, that town, and tell what time it was according to the shadows falling on the buildings. They had erected their city in such a way that you could tell what time it was just by the shadows. Guys, we can't even do that today. So, again, don't let somebody tell you. Besides the fact that who ultimately created Noah's brain? God did. God is never going to give you a task that you cannot complete. Then somebody says, all right, he wouldn't have had enough time to build an ark that big. How much time did he have?
120 years.
Okay, let's get there. Look with me at Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. The Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for indeed he is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. How do I know that that does not mean that men are going to live only up to 120 years of age?
Because you have people living past 120 years of age after the flood.
Okay. So after the flood, we got people that live longer than that. In fact, if you got your convicted book, you might flop open to, let's see, what page? Look at page 107. Page 107, it gives you the timeline, and you'll notice where it's got the line where it says the flood begins in 1656. After that, you've got Arphaxad, you've got Selah, you've got Eber, you've got Peleg. All of those people lived longer than 120 years. So you cannot look me in the eye and tell me that this was God limiting the lifespan of man, because all of these people came after the flood. Morrison LaHaye, in their book on the flood, they show that 4 men could have cut, dressed, and installed about 15 cubic feet of lumber per day. Thus, if Noah and his sons had worked 6 day weeks, they could have installed 4,680 cubic feet per year. If we safely estimate that the ark would have required 380,000 cubic feet of wood, then it would have required Noah and his sons only 81 years to accomplish this feat. Leaving him plenty of time, guys, to pitch it within and without pitch, and to gather the food necessary. Questions or comments so far? You guys are quiet. We've already talked about the fact that he would have needed to get food for them, and we mentioned briefly the fact that man was vegetarian. I want to plant this in your minds for just a moment. It's one of those things that it may have happened, it may not have happened. I've heard it said that God may have not used direct, divine, miraculous intervention to bring the animals to the ark. That he actually, if you've got 100 years, you could actually have done it basically through the weather, to where you are pushing the animals to the food source, causing droughts in certain areas and causing certain areas to have lots and lots of more food, so that through a 50 to 100 year migration, basically all the animals were very close by, and all Noah had to do was open the door and it's time to load them up. That holds a little bit of validity in that had God caused it to be very lush and tropical within, say, a 50, 100-mile radius of the ark, that would also mean that it would have been a lot easier for him to go out and collect the food necessary. What about the size of the ark? Somebody read me Genesis chapter 6. Starting in verse, 13 through 15.
Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits.
Okay, somebody tell me what's gopher wood?
Nobody knows.
Very good answer. We don't know what gopher wood is. I get asked the question a lot on the weekends, have we found Noah's Ark? And, I know there are a lot of people who claim that maybe they've seen parts of it or that, they've gone over to Turkey or whatever. Guys, I'm going to give you my opinion and understand up front this is strictly opinion. This is not, I've read Ron Wyatt's stuff. I don't agree with it, but I don't think we found it, and I don't think we're going to. And the reason being, God has been very effective at making sure we haven't discovered things that we would worship. I mean, if you think about it for just a moment, we don't have the cross that Jesus was crucified on. We don't have the manger that he was put in when he was born. We don't have the Ark of the Covenant. We don't have all of these things because ultimately you and I both know that if we did, people would worship those instead of him. He's been very, very effective at making sure we don't have those things. And I think the same thing is true with the Ark. If we find this big boat sitting on a mountain and we finally discover what gopher wood is, what do you think Home Depot's going to stock?
Yeah.
Dude, that's all anybody want ever. It'd be like, okay, I want my desk made of gopher wood. And yet, the reality of it is, God has been very, very, very effective at making sure we don't worship those things. How big was it? 300 by 50 by 30. Now, guys, you need to know when you're teaching people about this, a cubit is defined as the length of a man's forearm. There were actually 3 different cubits back then. There was the Babylonian cubit, the royal cubit, and then what we would just call maybe the general cubit. They varied anywhere from roughly 17 to 22 inches. In the year 2001, there was a global study. It was a kinesiology study. And basically, to give you the whole rundown, basically automobile manufacturers were wanting to know what is the average size of man all across the planet because they were wanting to make a realistic crash dummy. So they did this study. They found out the average length of a man's forearm is 18.34 inches. Now, if we round that down to 18 inches, that means this boat was 450 feet long. A football field and a half. The very next verse, somebody read the next verse of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 16.
You shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark in the side of it. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks.
Okay, it's got 3 decks on it, guys. Knowing that, knowing the dimensions, knowing the outer dimensions, knowing the floor space, you can calculate how much storage volume Noah would have had. And I can tell you, Morse and LaHaye, they did that. They actually used a very conservative 17.5-inch cubit. He would have had 1.39 million cubic feet of storage space. That's a whole lot. I always, when I'm doing a seminar, I give it to people, using the terrain model just because I think you can probably better look at it that way. If you were to count boxcars, we know today that ark would have held at least 520 railroad boxcars. Now, you imagine for just a moment going to downtown Denver and finding a train yard that would hold that many trains. This thing was massive. Now, let's back up just a moment. He's out there building a boat this big. James mentioned earlier it probably hadn't rained, and we're going to touch on that, but I probably would agree. What do you think people were saying
Probably ridiculing him.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man, don't you know they thought he was nuts?
Oh,
What is rain?
What is right? You know what? No, what are you building? And he is sitting there preaching basically what Jonah was going to go to Nineveh and say. You guys better repent. You need to turn back. You need to come back to... And yet, unlike Nineveh, people just laughed at him and kept on going their own way. I don't know if Noah hired out help to get this done. You know, the slide that I showed you just a minute ago, those estimates are done using 4 men, basically meaning Noah and his 3 sons. He could have hired out help. We don't know. I don't know if anybody would have wanted to take that kind of ridicule, or it may have simply been he and his boys. Do we have any estimation of how long it took them? Look at the last verse of Genesis chapter 5. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So he's 500 years old, and then we transition into chapter 6 that begins to tell us about the sinfulness of man and the fact that now you've got a 120-year period to get this done. Now look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 6. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. God gives him a time period. He says, basically, look, 120 years, I'm cleaning everybody's plow. But apparently, Noah didn't need it. He got the job done ahead of schedule. I will point this out just because I know some of you guys do travel, and I highly, highly, highly recommend you checking it out. In San Francisco, off of Pier 45, there is a boat that you see on the screen that is docked. They've now made it into a museum. It is the last boat of an entire fleet of boats known as the Liberty ships. I'd heard about it long before I ever got to see it. In fact, if you guys will bear with me for just a minute, I'll show you some more pictures of it. Heard about it long before I ever got to see it. Called down and talked to a retired Navy man and asked him to tell me what he could tell me about this particular boat. He began to tell me things like when it was built. He told me which wars it had fought in, all these different things. In fact, he even, I have said this before in a lecture. I usually don't have enough time, so I don't say it much anymore, but President Roosevelt was the guy who had to approve this particular fleet of ships. And when he saw the blueprints for it, his exact words were, "It's a real ugly duckling, but it'll carry a heavy load." So obviously this particular boat wasn't, it wasn't made because it was pretty. It was made for one reason. Now let this guy talk for many, 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 many minutes before I finally asked him the one question that I really called him for, and that was I wanted to know, okay, what can you tell me about the size of this boat? And guys, understand, he didn't know me from Adam. He didn't know anything about me, but the next words out of his mouth were, "Do you own a Bible?" And I told him, absolutely, yes. I've got them. Didn't tell him that I had like 6 on my desk. He then followed that. I said, yeah, why? And he said, well, if you'll open it up to the book of Genesis, you can find in there the dimensions for this fleet. And I basically was kind of saying, what are you talking about? He goes on to say, yeah, that particular boat was built. Here we go. I think it's in this one. He said that particular boat was built to the dimensions of Noah's Ark. Now, guys, think about that for just a moment. They built an entire fleet of ships to the dimensions of Noah's Ark. Why do you think they did that?
Because it works.
Because it works. Absolutely it works. Not only does it work, guys, think about this. How in the world did anybody ever know that the ratio of 300 by 50 by 30 actually would float and not break up? They didn't. Nobody knew that. But we do know it today. Oh, me. One of these days I'm actually going to get in here and label some of these pictures. Let's see. Bear with me one more second. Oh, by the way, I will show you this one. That would be one of your elders coming down on a tube.
That's just wrong.
Let's see. There we go. Knew they were in here. Okay. There's the placard outside of the boat itself. So Liberty ships were for World War II. They were built from 41 to 45. They were merchant ships built to carry beans, bullets, and black gold to our fighting men around the world. Built faster than the Axis could sink them from a simple British design using identical parts. They were made in 60 days. There's a picture of how big this thing was. So that kind of gives you a perspective of how big the ark was. Now, back to where we were. Somebody tell me this. What about the animals? How many animals were on the ark?
Good question.
Great question. What is a skeptic's common charge? You couldn't get all of the what?
Animals on the earth.
Couldn't get all the species, is the word they usually use. Does the Bible actually say you got to take two of every species?
No, kind.
No. It says two of every kind. But here's something interesting we did a little while back. There was a book published in 1980 by a very well-known evolutionary taxonomist named Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr was definitely an evolutionist. He wrote a book called Principles of Systematic Zoology. In that book, he classified every animal that was known to walk on this earth. So we're using his numbers. Okay? Why not use the enemy's numbers? I mean, what better way to do this? According to Ernst Mayr, 3,700 mammals, 8,600 birds, 6,300 reptiles, 2,500 amphibians, for a total of 21,100 animals would have needed protection if we go by the word species. We immediately multiply that by 2, do we not? Because we know it was 2 of every unclean. We also know that it was 7 pair of the clean. So we go back through our Bible, we look at which animals were considered clean for sacrificing, and I can tell you that the total number of individual animals that would have needed protection, if you use the definition of species, it would have been pushing roughly 50,000. So imagine for just a moment, we've got to find room on a boat for 50,000 animals. Now, let's assume for just a moment that every one of these animals are sheep-sized. Now, knowing that your birds, your reptiles, your amphibians, most of those are going to be much, much smaller than that. I mean, you think about how much room a bird needs, or a frog, or a turtle. But you are going to have some elephants, some cows, some dinosaurs that would need more room. If we assumed the average size of all of these 50,000 animals to be sheep-sized, can we get 50,000 sheep-sized animals onto that boat?
If you've got 520 boxcars, sure.
We go back to that boxcar, we realize that one boxcar can hold 240 sheep-sized animals. Meaning I can get 125,000 sheep-sized animals onto those boxcars. Guys, all I had to get was 50. And again, that's using the species definition. The Bible differentiates the word kind, meaning he didn't have to take 2 golden retrievers, 2 Dalmatians, 2 German shepherds, 2 wolves, 2 coyotes. He could have simply taken 2 of the dog kind. But I do want you to see the math. We don't have any trouble getting species on that boat either. Questions or comments so far?
Take that.
This is more of a, more for members of the Church of Christ. But if we say that that Noah's Ark is just a good story or something like that, then there's nothing to liken our baptism unto.
Oh, that's a great point. Absolutely. You're talking about 2 Peter?
Yeah.
Or 1 Peter? Do you have that passage in front of you?
Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Keep going.
I'm going to back up a little.
Yes.
Who once were, verse 19, and with also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water.
There you go. Guys, Chuck brings up a great point, and that is, if this is just a story, what are we saying about redemption of man? And that's why I'm saying, if you guys don't teach and preach on this, you're missing just a phenomenal opportunity, because ultimately the flood is the consequence of sin. And we don't call sin sin anymore, which really frustrates me. We call it things like alternative lifestyle, or we call it pro-choice, or we got all these cleaner terms. We kind of sterilize sin. The fact of the matter is, sin exists today, and it's an abomination to God. And it was because of sin that he did what we're talking about right now. How did he get all the animals? Dean, I'll let you take this one.
God brought him to Noah, didn't he?
Ah, very good.
He didn't have to go out and find them, play scavenger hunt.
Look with me at Genesis chapter. Look at okay, Emerald. Look at Genesis chapter 6. Starting verse 19. Of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark. To keep them alive with you, they shall be male and female. The birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, of every creeping thing on the earth after its kind. Notice the next phrase. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So all Noah had to do was simply provide an ark with appropriate dimensions, with a door that would allow the animals to enter 2 by 2. God brought the animals to him.
Hey, Brad?
Yes, sir.
I think one thing we miss a lot when we talk about the account of Noah and the ark is we focus so much of our time on the natural, like the dimensions of the ark, how many animals, could he have gotten it done, was there enough space, and we don't realize that this was a miracle done by God. And so that's got to be the main focus, I think, is like it doesn't matter what the dimensions were necessarily. It doesn't matter what the dimensions were or whether Noah had to go out and get the animals or not. It was all done by God. So we
Okay,
the idea that
Dean, 100%, I agree with you, but again, if you're talking to a skeptic, do they believe in miracles anyway?
they believe in evolution.
Very nice. Touche. Hopefully, though, you recognize the fact that they're not going to buy the whole miracle thing anyway. So, yes.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I don't really think that this is so much a miracle because God did it through very natural things. Really, the only miracle was there was no miracle. I can't see it. God had all the things right, and He set up everything for Noah in order to get everything on the ark.
Okay. There had to be one or two things that may have been miraculous. Let me give you an example. You've got that many animals coming 2 by 2 onto the ark. I suspect that may have taken a miraculous hand.
Right.
Just because some of those animals may not have wanted to be in line with the ones in front or behind them. I don't know. And if, to me, it would have been miraculous getting all of the animals. Can you see Noah? He's like 24 days out, and he's like, "Oh man, I forgot the hippopotamus." Well, it's too late. Hippo's done. It's not like if you leave your keys somewhere, you can go back and get your keys. That animal's dead. But I agree totally with you, Chuck, in that when you look at the vast majority of this account, there is so much that it could have taken place naturally that it's almost like you can pull the word miracle out of it and realize that it is a very natural account. Speaking of that, let's look at one more thing real quick. Talking about whether it's miraculous or not. Somebody tell me how Noah and his family could have cared for, let's just round the number to 50,000. How do you care for 50,000 animals? Call who?
I said call John Warrens. He's used to having a big family.
I don't feed animals.
I was going to say, his children are not animals.
That wasn't the implication.
Kids.
I wasn't trying to call it.
It could have been.
What do you guys think? Let's think about it this way for just a moment. Most of us have had pets at one time or another. Okay? It is a chore feeding, watering, and cleaning up after, say you got a dog or a cat or 2 dogs or 3 cats or whatever you got. Guys, think about think about just the job of cleaning up after that many animals. How do you do it?
I think as far as, cleaning up waste and stuff, you just throw it in the water. What? I'm serious. You don't want that sticking around.
Okay, I agree with you there. Because, guys, the window being a cubit from the roof, unlike what most people picture, like a window that you'd look out of, and more than likely that was a ventilation window.
Right.
It was a cubit from the roof. And there's very, very good reason to believe that, as nasty as this may sound, that was a methane release valve, so to speak, to get rid of the stink. There are some pretty good pictures. In fact, let me show you this. On the screen, you see a book that was written by a guy by the name of John Woodmarapp. called a feasibility study. And while I don't necessarily, I wouldn't recommend it to you to read just as for fun. It's a very, very, very valuable resource if you are, number one, if you have interest in the flood account. Number two, if you're one of these people that wants to know how in the world could they do this. What he does is he goes into the statistics of how 8 people could have used 80 man-hour days. That means each one of them working 10 hours a day, how they could account for the waste management, the feeding, and the watering of that many animals. And he even has diagrams of what he feels like was probably the construction on the inside that would have allowed for much easier cleanup, feeding, and watering to make it basically kind of a systemized deal where, you don't have 50,000 water bowls. You have a long trough that is able to take care of a bunch of animals. Or you have a way that basically the waste could be scooped into an area that would then be able to be pushed out into the water or down into a central trough in the water. But the point is, it could have been done. Now, let's revisit what Dean was saying just a minute ago. He was saying, Brad, one of the points we need to make is this is a miracle. And granted, yes, as Christians, we don't need to shy away from miracles. Is it possible that they didn't even have to feed or water these animals?
Yep.
What could God have done through his power?
Put them in a hibernative state.
Yeah.
Put them in a hibernative state.
Absolutely. So you got animals that could have basically been like a bear. God puts them to sleep. Maybe they eat a few weeks into this thing. They eat a lot. Everything's cool. And then they go to sleep, and they're asleep the rest of the time. They don't poop. They don't drink. They don't eat. And everything's chilly until it's time to get off the boat. Is that possible? Absolutely. Would that require the miraculous hand of God? Absolutely. Questions or comments so far? Yes, no, maybe?
No.
Okay. Somebody tell me, how long were they on that boat?
150 days.
Or keep trying.
Oh, a year.
About 371 days. We know, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 4, there was 40 days of rain. That's what we usually always think of. We think, okay, 40 days, 40 nights. We also know, according to verse 24, that there was 110 additional days of water prevailing on the earth. So you're already up to 150 days. That's water on the earth. Now, from that point forward, the water starts to recede. You got 74 days until the mountains were viewed, this being the 17th day from the 7th month of the first day of the 10th month, according to Genesis chapter 8, verse 5. You got 40 more days elapsed before Noah sent out the raven. 7 days elapsed before he sent out the first dove. 7 more days elapsed before he sent out the dove the second time. 7 days elapsed again before he sent out the dove the final time. 29 days elapsed to correlate with the date of the 601st year, first month, first day, Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. 57 more days then elapsed before Noah and the animals actually get off the boat, for a total of 371 days. I'm asked a lot the question, how in the world could there be green stuff already there? How do you got an olive branch in the dove's mouth? Guys, understand there was only 150 days that water was on the earth. After that, things started drying up. Things started to recede and go back to normal. So 150 from 371, you're looking at roughly 220 days of decent weather to bring this thing back. You can go through spring and summer in that amount of time. What do we know about seeds? What would have happened to the seeds? Oh, come on now. Seeds have got a waxy substance that coats most of them. So if it rains, what are most seeds going to do?
Float.
They're going to float. In fact, there's a really cool theory called the mat theory. That, you know, you got all the wood that's floating around out there. You guys have seen rivers after a really, really, really violent rainstorm, and they've got logs and they've got branches and they've got all this stuff rushing down. Well, think about a global flood where you've got mats of trees and plant life and seeds and rubbish and all this kind of stuff that have kind of basically come together, they've floated together, and have formed literally mats that would then, once everything goes down, be able to plant, thrive, and keep growing. Okay. Question next. Where'd the water go? We've already talked about this a little bit. You guys remember I told you there are 3 places that you need to keep in mind of where the water went. Let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 7. I'm sorry, chapter 8. Look with me at verse, let's see, chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Let's stop right there. The word remembered right there, God remembered Noah. You guys probably already know the Hebrew for that word is the word zakar, and it means to draw closer to. So God remembered Noah. Do you honestly think that God put him on this boat and turned his back? No. Who closed the door of the ark?
God.
God.
God did. In fact, somebody read me Genesis chapter 7, verse 1.
And the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous.
Oh, no. No, and somebody's got the New King James needs to read that for me.
I got you, Brad.
There you go. Thank you, brother.
And the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all.
Oh, right there. What's that word?
Come.
He said, come. He didn't say, go get into it. He said, come. What is the implication there?
If God was in the ark, I guess your implication.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. If God closed the door, he was a very active, very present being. The text says, the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all of your household. He didn't say go get in it, go get in the boat. So, you know, we got to remember, number one, God is present, he's active, he's there. Chapter 8, verse 1, then God remembered Noah and every living thing. Where'd the water go? Number one, he calls the wind to pass over the earth. And we'll stop right there.